Hello, everyone. Welcome to our now annual back to school edition of Knowledge Management here at APQC. Really excited today to be having a conversation around communities of practice, personally one of my favorite topic areas. And I am Lynda Braksiek, the research lead here at APQC for Knowledge Management. And I am thrilled to be joined today by Stan Garfield, known author, speaker, and expert in the area of communities of practice. And just found out in talking with Stan prior to the webinar today that the last time he spoke at a webinar for APQC was 2010. So I'm guessing a lot of you maybe haven't seen him before on a webinar. So we're really excited to have Stan joining us today. Now, we're going to do a little bit of reminders at the beginning, some upcoming engagements for APQC that I think you all will be interested to know about. I'm going to touch on just a couple pieces of research and some insights to help prepare you for our conversation with Stan today about long-lasting and effective communities of practice. And as always, we provide you with a lot of key takeaways and resources when you leave today. So for those of you who aren't able to join us on the call today and will be looking at this afterward, please make sure you look through all the resources. There's some really good stuff there. And as always with our webinars, we really love it when people are engaged throughout the entire webinar. So please put your questions or your comments in the chat function, and we'll try to accommodate as many, if not all of them, throughout the conversation today. We also will take the information shared today and we will be putting it into a summary that will be available in our resource library here at APQC. So you can see all of the interesting discussions and conversation that happen throughout the webinar. So again, welcome, and we're really excited that you're all here. So to get started, I just want to give you a couple of reminders with some upcoming engagements. We always have webinars every month, and we have a couple coming up that will also involve some of our members having conversations around things like engagement strategies for KM, and also around how to assess really the readiness of change within your organization. So please, if you can, join us for those. They're going to be fantastic. We also have roundtables for our members that we have on a quarterly basis. And ironically, coming up at the end of September, we're going to be having a conversation around communities of practice. So if you're a member and you haven't joined one of our roundtables before, please sign up for this. It's a great time to dialogue with other KM practitioners and leaders and talk about some of the practices that are going on, in this case, in the area of communities of practice. And then in December, we're going to close out the year talking about the future of KM and what those roles and skill sets and that expertise might be needed to take us forward into the next new year from a knowledge management perspective. And also, we have a knowledge manager certification course. If you're not familiar, take a look at the link here and go check it out. We have some amazing training programs, but our knowledge manager certification course is fantastic. So take a look. And now to get us started and to get our minds in the framework of communities of practice, I wanted to just share a couple pieces of research with you. Now, this information is from our Priorities and Trends survey for 2024. And I just wanted to remind everybody, what were those top priorities for knowledge management teams this year? And I want you to put on your community of practice hat as you're listening to Stan go forward today and think about how you can be addressing and tackling some of these priorities for your knowledge management program within your own organization. So how can a community help something like transferring expertise, knowledge across the organization? How can it help you with identifying and prioritizing the critical knowledge? And something that's very popular right now, what can a community do to help you with the incorporation of all of these new technologies we have available to us, like generative AI? So be thinking about some of these priorities and applying that community of practice hat as we go through the conversation today. And then I wanted to share this with you. This is from a piece of research from a couple of years ago where we dove into how people actually are managing knowledge sharing and collaboration across their organizations. And these were the most common approaches identified by respondents to our survey. And you can see community of practice is still in that #1 space. So it's still a very common, it's still a very practical, it's a very effective way of ensuring that knowledge is flowing across the silos, across the globe within your organization. And I'm sure Stan will probably touch on this too, but I know from my own experience that if I had to give up certain things in knowledge management, the one thing I would never want to give up is my ability to have communities of practice within my organization. I've seen firsthand myself the benefits it provides to an organization, and our research shows us that when you begin with communities, you can really put something in place that will be long lasting and that will help enable the rest of your knowledge management capabilities as you progress through the maturity of your KM journey. So with that being said, I don't want to take any more time away from Stan, but I do always like to know who's on the call with us today. What do you know about communities of practice, and how are you managing it within your organization? So tell us just a little bit about your program. How mature are communities in your organization? You might call them networks, you might call them something else, but it's groupings of people coming together to discuss similar topics. So just let us know how you're doing. If you don't have a community program, that's okay. If you have a robust and thriving one, that's okay too. I'm excited to see what kind of an audience we have today. And I know I should say this too, for Stan's information is going to be valuable regardless where you are in your journey. So look at that, Stan. We only have just a handful that don't have anything yet. So a lot of people just getting started. About a third have communities, but they're not all active. Some have 25% have robust and thriving communities. That is amazing. That is a great number. I love that. All right, I expect those that have these robust and thriving programs to be putting some comments in our chat today as we go through. So with that, I am going to now pass it on to our expert in communities of practice, Stan Garfield. Welcome, Stan. We're so excited to have you, and I will turn the ball over to you.
Thank you, Lynda, and thank you for inviting me to talk today. It's a pleasure to be here. As Lynda mentioned, I presented the Communities Manifesto back in March of 2010, 14 years ago, and I'm still talking about communities today. So today we're going to talk about how to start and sustain a program and get into some details of how to do that. And so we'll start with what makes a great community. So it starts with choosing the topic of community. Sometimes we just go right past it and try to get into the details, but you actually have to pick a topic that people identify with, that they're passionate about. It's got to be relevant to them so that they're motivated to join. So it starts with that. Choose the right topic, call it something that people can relate to. You got to achieve a critical mass of members, right? So if you have a small community, it might have some enthusiastic people, but over time, very difficult to sustain a lively community with a small number. According to my work and my research, 100 to 200 is a better target, and the more you can get above that, the better. We'll talk more about why that is. You need a community leader, somebody who knows the subject, has energy for stimulating collaboration, has time to devote to leadership, and is willing to do the basics that are required to keep a community going. It's generally a good idea to have regular events like this one, where the people can actually hear one another, come together either virtually or in person. And especially true, most communities thrive on active online discussions, regular posts, multiple replies to posts, no unanswered questions. A community that's thriving demonstrates all of these attributes. Now, when I presented back in 2010, the topic was 10 Principles for Successful Communities. So if any of you happen to be on that call back then, you may recall, but I'll quickly go through those again. Communities need to be independent of organizations, not aligned totally to an organization structure. They are not organizations themselves. They're collections of people who voluntarily come together to deepen their expertise in a given topic. They are not sites or tools. Sometimes people tend to refer to a website or some tool as a community. It's not, it's people. They should be voluntary, meaning that people choose to join them, are not forced to join them. The leaders of a community should volunteer to lead them and want to lead them, not be told to lead them. They should be boundary spanning, meaning they cut across organizational silos. The discussion right now that's going on in the community that I lead, the SIKM leaders, is talking about this very subject of silos. And communities don't eliminate silos, but they can connect people across them by boundary spanning, which is a powerful benefit of communities. You should avoid redundancy in communities, not have multiple communities on the same topic. That can be very frustrating for people trying to figure out which one to join. It tends to fragment the knowledge into different silos. It's not a good idea. You want to build critical mass, a critical mass that we talked about being 100 to 200 or more, where that's because of the 99-1 rule of thumb, which is that 90% of any community will probably never post at all. So if you have a small number like 10 in a community, that means that only one person will ever post. That's usually not a good thing. You want to start with a broad topic, one that can encompass a lot of different subcategories. And then if necessary over time, you can subdivide it if the volume dictates that. But if you start with too narrow a topic, you may never take off, may never reach that critical mass. You have to actively nurture communities. They don't just happen on their own typically. And finally, there's a set of targets, types, activities, requirements, goals, expectations, and tools that you can use to both manage and govern your community's program. Let's start with how to start and sustain a program. There's 4 stages. I'll talk about preparing, launching, growing, and sustaining. So in preparing, if you're just getting started, and some of you indicated in the poll that Lynda posted that you're just getting started with communities, which is great. There's never a bad time to start with communities, but you want to start out by learning more about the field. So attending an event like today is a good start. Reading books, reading blogs, attending conferences. There are lots of ways to learn about the field, but learn more about it. Don't just try to go into it without knowing. Find out more, and then that'll be helpful to you. Then you want to identify the objectives. Why are you doing communities? What's your purpose? If someone asks you, what's this all about? You should be able to answer that. And in particular, you should be able to articulate a vision for how you want this to work when it's really going well. So if someone says to you, I don't understand communities, you should respond with somewhat of a passionate, brief spiel about this is why we're doing it, this is how it works when it's going to be doing what we want, and people should get inspired by that. And I'll give you an example of a vision in a moment. And then you need to define compelling use cases. Why should someone use a community? What's it good for? When should you use communities over other alternatives? So a vision for a community program. Here's one from me. I understand that you might have a different one. That's fine. If you want to borrow one like this and adapt it for your organization, that's great. But you got to have some vision that you can articulate that says when it's working, this is what it looks like. So my vision for a communities program is that you have a single global cross-functional community for each major specialty and role. So if someone wants to find a community about something that they're passionate about, they can find one because it exists. Second is you want everyone to belong to at least one community. It doesn't have to be more than one, but there should be a community that's somewhat relevant to them and to their work. All community members are engaged and responsive, meaning they don't just join the community and then they ignore it. They actually pay attention to what's going on in it and participate as appropriate. That participation can just be reading what's happening. It can be attending calls. It doesn't have to be posting, but they have to be paying attention at least, if not posting. That there are timely responses. When somebody posts something, there's a response given so they don't sit there waiting forever. There's active monitoring, and there's follow-up by the community managers as necessary. In a very successful community, the community managers don't need to do too much of that. The community does pretty well on its own, but there's always somebody monitoring it to make sure that that's true. You need to redirect relevant knowledge to the most relevant community. So if you are a community manager and you see something that's being discussed outside of the community, let's say through an email discussion, you want to try to nudge that into the community where others can benefit from it and where it can reside and be found later. Each community should offer a site where people can go to find out about it, to join it, and find its content. You should recognize and respond when people share and like and reply and praise in a community. Let them know that you appreciate the fact that they're doing that. Provide a variety of ways for the community members to interact, whether that's through email, whether that's through mobile, through a web browser, through an app, through an RSS feed, whatever it may be. Give them the ways to use it in ways that are convenient for them. Ensure a user-friendly process is existing for requesting and creating new communities. So if somebody wants a new community, it should be sort of obvious how to do that. And then there's a process they go through, and they either get their communities created or they get an explanation of why it wasn't and are steered towards joining another community that already exists. And finally, a single global platform is available, which includes a community directory, standard sites, and standard tools. Now, a long time ago, I created this and became somewhat of a popular image and acronym for explaining what are the use cases for communities. We coined the term SAFARIs. SAFARI stands for share, ask, find, answer, recognize, inform, and suggest. And my assertion is that these 7 use cases are best addressed by communities and aren't addressed as well by other options. So for instance, if you're going to go and share something, the community is probably the best way to do that. If you have a question to ask, asking the community is probably the most effective way to get an answer. And similarly for the other items on the list. So what you can do with people who are skeptical about communities is that you can pose to them, the last time you had a need for a resource, how did you go about trying to find it? And they'll probably explain some step they went through. Maybe they called somebody, maybe they sent out an email to a few people. But you can then show them that that may not have worked as well as had they used the community to find that resource. And what you can suggest to them is the next time they need to do that, that they try it this way, and maybe you'll help and sit by them and help them do it, but you'll help them try using a community instead of the other way and show them that it actually works better than their alternative. So when you make your use case pitch, it should be that these are the things communities do well, and they do them better than alternatives, and you should challenge people to try them out and prove for themselves that they do in fact work better. Now, if you ask what should people do in a community if they join it, what are they expected to do once they're there? There's 5 activities, which I coined the acronym SPACE to describe. One is to subscribe, meaning that they actually get notified when there's new posts in the threaded discussions so they're aware and they can learn from them and possibly even respond to them. That they should post at least once in a while, start a new thread or reply to a threaded discussion. Now, I understand that really only 10% of a community will actually ever do that, but you can certainly encourage people to do it. Hopefully, you'll get the 10% that do. Attend. If you have a community call like today's webinar, if you have meetings and other events, you want them to attend those. If you go to the trouble of putting them on and inviting a speaker and going to the trouble of all the logistics, you want people to benefit from that, so they should show up. Contribute. If you have a community newsletter or a blog or a wiki or a website where content can be submitted, you want members to help contribute to that. And engage, asking a question, making a comment, giving a presentation, doing something within the community, although for most people, engaging will mean just paying attention to what's going on, which is fine. Stage 2 is launching the community. So you want to get senior leadership. Yes, go ahead.
Before you go on, we have lots of questions coming in, so I want to make sure we get some of them answered maybe throughout. And
sure,
you can tell us if you think you're going to cover some of them as we go forward. But there's a couple of questions around measuring. So I think will you get to measures later on?
I will. I have a section on measurements.
Okay, so we'll hold off on the measuring. And we do have a question around if a COP has kind of died down due to maybe some layoffs and things like that, how do you kind of rejuvenate, especially if you've lost a sponsor and things like that?
So if you lost a sponsor, then the question first would be, is your community active nonetheless? If so, you can still be successful. If not, then the question would be, all right, is there some other sponsor you need to seek? If you've had a change in leadership in the community, should you seek out another community leader? But once a community has been launched, if they have an effective community leader, they can withstand a lot of things that may go on in the organization. In fact, that's one of the benefits of communities is they're independent of organization. So as the organization changes and thrashes, the community can persist. So depending on what the nature of the change is, if it's just a community that's for some reason has fallen into a lull, then among the things that you would want to do is maybe look to see, maybe you need another community leader in addition to the one, or maybe you need to replace one with somebody who's got more energy for it. Maybe they kind of got tired of doing it after a while, or they had some other work demands that made it harder to spend time on it. So it may just be a question of injecting some new community leadership. And then if you haven't been doing some of the basics, returning to those basics. Start priming the pump again with discussions, start holding meetings again, get some experts to come and be involved. So the same things you would do at launch, you would just repeat those if the community's gone into the doldrums.
Okay, cool. And I think our other question is around keeping members engaged. And I think you might talk about that when you talk about sustainment and stuff as well. So
yeah, to keep members engaged, typically it's through the online discussions and if you have meetings, through the meetings. So if you have a monthly call, You keep them engaged by continuing to have a monthly call with hopefully an attractive topic or an attractive speaker. And if you have online discussions, then if they're happening organically, then that usually sustains itself. But if not, then as the leader, you need to do some priming of the pump, which means you would start a discussion, or you'd go and ask somebody outside the community, hey, I'm going to start this discussion. Would you please help me out by replying, and let's get it going again. So the same things you would do as you're starting, you would do to prime it again.
Awesome. Just being very intentional about keeping it moving, right?
Yes. So
okay.
The very best communities, and then ones that have been running successfully, you don't really have to do that. So the SICAM Leaders Community that I lead has been in existence for 19 years. And I don't typically have to go and start a discussion anymore. In the early days I did, but now it's mostly just monitoring the ones that are going on. So that's the mark of a successful community, is when the leader doesn't have to do as much.
Love that. Okay, I will give it back to you.
Okay, thanks. So it's launching. You want to start out with getting some leadership support. Lynda mentioned having a sponsor. You don't have to have one, but it's certainly helpful if you do, because that encourages other people to realize, okay, if I spend time in here, that's okay. I won't get dinged for that. You want to choose the right platform, the one that can do what you need, has the basic functionality. You want to define governance to prevent redundancy of communities and to avoid having real narrow niche communities. And make sure your community topics are chosen carefully. Select community managers that have passion and time. Recruit respected experts to visibly participate. I mentioned that briefly, but if you get people that are respected to be active in your community, that'll tend to attract more members, because they'll see those people there and they'll want to be where they are. Priming the pump generally means posting yourself into a community discussion that other people then respond to. Personally recruiting members. So if you don't have a lot of members to start with, you have to go and find members and ask them personally, will you please join? I could really appreciate it. Can you bring some other colleagues of yours to join? And do the basic things to build up to critical mass. And then publicize. Publicize is not something that you just do at launch. You kind of keep doing it forever. And through doing that, you keep attracting new members. So I don't really have to publicize the SICAM Leaders Committee, but I regularly post about it, and that's publicizing it. And those attracts new members to keep joining. And if you see people keep joining, that's a sign you're doing something right. And if you see members keep leaving, that's a sign maybe you need to readjust. 5 tools for communities that are helpful is to have a site where people can find out about the community, a calendar of events where they can see what events are coming up, the events themselves, whether those are meetings or conference calls or webinars, some sort of news, could be a newsletter or could be a blog, way of communicating to people. This is often helpful if they're not paying full attention to the discussions, but if they get a monthly newsletter in their inbox, it can remind them of what's been discussed and may pull them back into those discussions. And then the actual threads, the online threaded discussions, those are usually the most important part of online communities. In the growing stage, where you've already taken off, you've got communities that are going, it's a good idea to create a community of community managers. That allows them to share tips and tricks with each other, but also it gives you a chance to lead by example. You can show your other community managers how to lead a community by doing it yourself. So they're participating in that community. They see what you're doing. They can mimic that in their communities. You can set clear expectations for community managers about what those are. We'll show that in a moment. You have to curate the threaded discussions. If they get split, unfortunately, or if there's ones that should be split or whatever needs to happen, curating is one of the roles of a community manager. Redirecting questions that are sent through other channels. When someone asks a question of you through email, you want to kind of point them back into the community and say, be glad to answer that, but let's answer it in the community so others can see the answers and also others can provide answers in addition to just what you provide. Demonstrating how communities are better than alternatives is usually a way of growing your communities. Once again, back to your Safari's use cases, if you show people that if they ask a question in the community, they'll get an answer much more quickly and from more reliable sources than if they use another method, that will help grow your communities. If you can get your senior leaders to model desired behaviors, that's a great one, because if the senior leaders are active in the community, many people will follow their lead and be active in there as well. So anything you can do to get them to post, reply, comment, praise, present, that's a great benefit to building up your communities. There's a question about metrics, which we'll cover, but you want to set goals and measure progress against them to see how you're doing. You can set a weekly calendar reminder to post and reply. So if there hasn't been a post in the community for a while, this reminder will cause you to go in there and post something to prime the pump again. Recognizing and rewarding people for desired behaviors. If you happen to have a rewards program or recognition program that already exists, use that as a way of recognizing those people that are active in your communities. Maybe you recognize the experts that you bring in, or the people that are answering questions, or the people that are speaking on your calls through formal recognition and reward. And then collect and promote success stories. One of the nice things about communities is they provide their own examples of success by the interactions that the members have. So unlike other tools where it's harder to prove that they're valuable, community provides that proof from within. So if you have someone who asks a question and then someone else answers the question and the first person says, thank you, that's just what I needed, that solved my problem, I really appreciate it, you can just pull that little interchange out, collect that up in a place where you then tell people, here are hundreds of examples of where that happened. And if someone questions the value of communities, you have actual proof from the communities themselves to show the value. So that's something that I really encourage. And it's one of the nice benefits of communities, that they can promote success stories organically. So the expectations for community leaders is that they could schedule events, meaning lining up speakers like Lynda scheduled me for this call today, and I do the same for SIKM. You bring the speakers in, put them in a schedule, attract people to come attend the call. You host the calls and webinars. You answer questions that people put in, make sure that they get answered. You may not answer them yourselves. In fact, you don't want to answer all the questions yourself, but you want to make sure that somebody answers them, because nothing is more frustrating than someone who's finally been encouraged to come and join the community. Maybe they've tentatively and reluctantly asked their first question and are waiting expectantly for the results, and they don't get an answer. They'll be frustrated. They may not come back. But if they get an answer right away, and it's a good one, that's a really good way of showing them that it was worth it, and shows the other people that if they ask their questions, they'll get answered as well. Also, if somebody's checking out your community to see whether or not to join, if they check out your threaded discussions and they see that there are lots of unanswered questions, they'll be skeptical about joining. Like, why should I join? Nothing ever happens. But if they see that somebody asked a question yesterday and got an answer an hour later, they'll probably realize that's potentially valuable and wish to join. Now, you don't have to post all the time in a community, but when you start one out, you often post more than the other members, because you have to kind of prime the pump and lead by example. So you do that. You might post to share information. You might post to start a discussion. But whatever you do, posting is something that you do to help show people the way. And later on, you don't have to do as much. And expand, you're attracting new members, you're soliciting new content, and that's something that as a manager of a community, you're always doing. You're looking to keep growing the community so other people can benefit from it. Stage 4 is sustaining. You continue doing all the things I just mentioned in stage 3, but you also, as a role as a communities program manager, you have a set of activities that I'll talk about in a moment, and you continue to coach your community managers to lead effectively through your community of community managers and through one-on-one coaching. The role of the communities program manager first is to do what I'm doing here today, which is evangelize. When I was working at Deloitte, I had the title of community evangelist. So that's not something to shy away from. It's good to evangelize, to let people know what communities are, how they can benefit from them, and get them excited about it as much as you are. So that's number one role. There's program and project management of whatever you're doing, whether that's implementing new communities or adding new functionality or starting new concepts. Whatever you're doing, someone needs to lead the way, and the communities program manager makes sure that happens. Leading by example, always important. So you have to be active in communities yourself. Nothing is worse than telling everybody else they should join and be active, but then you're nowhere to be seen. So you should be somebody that they look to as an example and that they emulate. You should educate people about communities. It's always new to some people. They don't quite get the concept, but you educate them so that they do, and that they're more knowledgeable and willing to join and participate. You communicate about what's going on, which communities are being added, what's going on in way of events and activities, anything that you can use to let people know about developments in the program. You actually implement communities. When a new community is requested, you're involved in approving that. If it's approved, then you help to actually put that up in place and steer them along through the launch. You support communities in an ongoing fashion through the community managers community and through whatever support mechanisms you have in place. You do reporting on the communities. How are they doing? Which ones are alive? Which ones are needing help? Which ones are sort of in the middle? There's governance, where you make sure that you don't create communities that are redundant or that are too narrow. And then there's learning. You continue to learn about communities. Even though you may already know a lot, there's always more to be learned. You can study what others are doing. You can continue to attend events like this and continue to read about the subject. 10 tips for leading communities. The first one would be to choose your topic carefully. We've talked about that, but great place to start. The second one is to publicize communities, which is to make people aware of them so they can join and make sure that they know about the activities and events that go on in them. Then increasing membership. You're always looking to grow your community. If you're not yet at critical mass, you're trying to reach critical mass. Once you've exceeded critical mass, then you're just looking to get more people to benefit from it. If you think about it this way, if the community is already thriving, let's say you have 1,000 members in your community, which is great. You're looking for the 1,001st member to join because there's no cost to that. There's no burden for that 1,001st member. But that 1,001st member can come in and maybe they'll start contributing, or at least they'll start learning. So that's a plus, right? Each new member that comes in and starts learning or can share something is a plus. So sometimes people will get into a debate with me about community size. They'll argue that you can have effective small communities. I've not seen that over a long period of time, or that you don't want a community to be too large. And I argue that you can't have a community that's too large. You may have a community that has too much volume of activity, which is a different problem. So if you had a community, like let's take example, the SIKM Leaders Community, it has over 1,200 members, but they're not all posting. They're there, they're learning, hopefully they're benefiting from it. But when they get the 1,201st member, that doesn't cause any real change in anything, right? The problem you want to monitor for is the volume ever reach a level where it's too much? So if you were getting a situation where there were hundreds of posts a day in your community, we'd probably agree that's more than we can keep up with. In which case, that's a case where you might split the community into sub-communities, into subtopics, where the volume becomes more manageable. So I always say to people who want to form a narrow niche community that start with the broad ones. If there's already a community that covers your subject as a subset, start there. And if over time your subtopic becomes so it has such a high volume, then you can split that off. You will have proved that that's possible, that it will work, and that will be merited, and you'll split it off, and it'll have its own successful community. But in my experience, that has rarely happened, right? So most of the time, the problem with communities is not that they're too active. The problem is often that they're not active. But if the case, that's a nice problem to have, and it's easily solved by splitting the community up so the volume gets back to a manageable level. Posting and replying is something that I mentioned that community managers should be doing on an ongoing basis. I mentioned that you shouldn't have to respond to everything. You should let other members respond. But the times when I respond as a community manager are, number one, if no one else is responding and I think I have something to offer, then I will. And number two, if I have something that I think is valuable on the topic that hasn't already been shared, then I'll wait a little bit, let others respond first, but then I'll jump in with my response. So I'm not trying to dominate the discussion. I don't want to appear as a know-it-all. I want other people to be, equally active. But there are occasions where I will reply. And one of those occasions that I will reply is when no one else has. So if someone's asked a question and there's been no answer after a day or two, then I will reply often by either saying, here's an answer, or more often I might just say, hey, I don't have an answer to this, but this question's unanswered. Can anyone else in the community answer? I'd really appreciate it if you would. And almost every single case, someone else will then respond with a helpful answer. So that's just priming the answer, right? You don't even have the answer yourself, but you post and stimulate it until they do. And sometimes you have to do that more than once. I've had to do that twice, but I never had to do it more than twice. By the second time, people start responding. So what you're basically doing is giving them permission to reply. They may have been reluctant. They may have worried that their answer isn't a good one, and so forth. Those are normal concerns. But then if you say no one's responded, they may get the courage then to say, well, nobody else has. I guess I will. And then usually they're rewarded with a lot of thanks for their response. The members, the leaders of the community need to use the collaboration tools themselves. So if they have an online discussion, they need to use that. If they have a wiki, they need to use that. They have to use the tools to set the example for the other members of the community. The community manager will typically be the host of the events. So just as Lynda's hosting this call today, they often will provide useful content. So they're on the lookout for useful content that the members would benefit from, and then they're sharing it. They generally explain how to participate. So if somebody's new, they may have guidelines that they'll share with new members and give them examples of how they should participate in the community. They'll set goals and measure progress for each community, and then they'll solicit and collect and promote success stories from the community. And often you put those on the community site, so someone who's coming and checking it out, deciding whether to join, can see, okay, I should go ahead and join. Okay, we're into the impact of technology on communities. We'll start by talking about community platforms. This sometimes comes up and people get in discussion about which community platform to use. So you can see from the list on the right, there are a lot of community platforms out there. This is a list of 50, and there's probably a lot more. So how do you choose from all those? You look for things like, what's the user satisfaction of the customers of those platforms? What's the ease of integration between it and other tools? You generally need to integrate your community tools into your larger KM and intranet environment. What's the staying power of the company? Has it been around for a while? And many of these companies tend to come and go and get absorbed by others. Does it have the functionality that you're looking for in a community platform? Does it integrate with email? Now, this is interesting because people might say, well, email, that's an old technology, and why should we bother with that? But in fact, everyone still uses email, right? So if you don't have integration with it, you may miss out on the ability of people to conveniently follow what's going on in the community. So even though people will swear that they don't like email, they'll still be in it most of the time. So make sure you're integrated with that, but also with mobile apps so people can interact with it on their phones if they prefer. You need moderator capabilities to be able to do the things like curating the threads and merging and splitting up content. And you should be able to tag, search, and sort the discussions that are going on. So in the list over there, I've seen the ones in bold are various ones that I use, but at the top you see a picture of the platform we use for the SICAM leaders community, which is based on a technology called groups.io. It's worked out well for us. It's basically the successor to Yahoo Groups, and it's worked out well for our community, but there are plenty of other platforms that you can look at. And then in the specific area of enterprise social network platforms, which are more of a social media style interaction that people are accustomed to by using tools like Facebook and Twitter, then these tools tend to have a lot of turnover in them. I've had to update this chart many times, and it usually has a completely new set of apps on it. But the one that I'll highlight that probably has the best match for community functionality is Microsoft's Viva Engage that you see listed there. It used to be known as Yammer. That one probably is the best fit. So if you're looking at all these, which ones to use, I'd start by looking at that. You may already be a Microsoft shop. You may already have a Viva Engage license, but if not, I would encourage you to look at that. But obviously, there are other ones to look at as well. So if you're already a Google shop, then there's Google Chat. If you're already a Salesforce shop, you have Chatter and so forth. So there's other options, but they've been diminishing over time. So Viva Engage is kind of the one that many people look at. And then for virtual meeting platforms like we're having today, obviously many people use Zoom, but there are these other options as well that are all out there. So there's plenty of alternatives for meeting virtually. We're all used to them. The thing you may want to look at is what are people already most comfortable with and use that rather than something else. But it may also come down to which platform you're already using or have a license for. So if you already have a Microsoft Teams license, then you might be using Microsoft Teams. Now, when we talk technology, we often get into sort of, I would call the fatigue of AI, which is we're getting so much bombardment of news and advertisements and hype about AI today that can be off-putting. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a lot of potential to help us in all of knowledge management, but also specifically within communities. So I've given you a few examples here, and you can think of plenty more, I'm sure, where generative AI and large language model capabilities can be used to support communities. So for example, if you feed your discussion history from your community into a large language model and you have a chat capability there where it can use all of the previous discussions to help answer somebody's question, that could be a powerful use of that in support of a community. It's taking the knowledge that's already there, but making it more accessible than it might otherwise be. It could be used to summarize threads. So after a long threaded discussion like the one we're currently having about silos, you could point your chat GPT or equivalent tool at it and say, summarize this discussion. What are the key points that came up in it? It could listen to and summarize calls. So like today's call, if you had an AI tool looking at it, it might come back and say, here's the key points from the call rather than just providing the transcript. One of the things we're involved in SIKM is a mentoring program. So you could use AI as a mentor. In fact, there's now tools that will offer to clone you. So I haven't used it yet, but if I cloned myself, potentially I could act as a mentor to people without having to spend a lot of time myself doing so. So that could be a powerful use. And it could be used in a community to take some of the expert members of the community and have them be mentors to other members by having their knowledge collected within a single clone. It can be used to help classify and tag threads. One of the things that I manually do as a community manager is to make sure that tags get added to threads. Obviously, AI could do that for me. I wouldn't have to do it manually. It could aggregate across multiple communities. So, for example, there are multiple KM communities. SIKM is just one of them. There's also one KM4 Dev as an example. Well, if we pointed AI at both of those and said aggregate across them, then we could break down some of the silos temporarily or span boundaries between those communities so that we can get the benefit of both. I do that manually sometimes by saying in KM4 Dev, I'll point them back to the parallel thread in SIKM and vice versa. Well, it'd be nice if AI could just do that without me having to do it manually. It could find potential members and suggest to them that they join communities that are relevant to their interests. It could help moderate discussions by knowing what some of the guidelines are for the community and then helping to enforce them. And finally, it could find and share relevant external content. So if it's monitoring external news sources and blogs and articles and magazines, and it could feed some of that content in to the community through posts that it generates, that'd be helpful as well. The question about measurements comes up now in talking about measuring success. So program success, I coined the acronym PATCH for how you can measure the success of your program, starting with participation rate. What percent of your target population is a member of at least one community? So you might have a goal for that to be 100%. That was our goal when I was leading knowledge management at Hewlett Packard. You'll probably never achieve it, right? You won't get 100% of people to join a community. It's voluntary. They may choose not to. But you try to get as close to that as you can. And over the years, we got closer and closer to that. And we felt that was a good measure that we're having success as a communities program. Remember, the vision that I articulated said that everyone was a member of at least one community. So if that's part of your vision, then it's reasonable to have a goal for that, which is the participation goal. Second one would be anecdotes, the percent of communities that display testimonials, stories, and posts of thanks on their site. So someone goes to the site, they can see proof of the value of that community. So you want each community to be able to do that. Tools, the percent of communities that have the 5 key tools that I went through, the site, calendar, events, news, and threads. How many of them actually have those? You'd like it to be close to 100%. Coverage, what percent of the desired topics are covered by at least one community? So one thing that's helpful to do is sit down and try to figure out for your organization, what are the most important topics for our organization? And it could be 10, it could be 20, it could be 100, it could be 3. Each organization has different size and a different focus. But if you can figure out what are the subjects that we absolutely need to cover, then your coverage measurement is what percent of those actually have one community. So if you're in a small company, you might have a single community, right? I've told people if your community only has 200 people in it, you don't necessarily need lots of communities. In fact, they might not achieve critical mass if you had a lot of them. So you might start out with one, and then as your company grows, you might create more. But if you're in a large company with hundreds of thousands of people, you obviously can't have a single community. So then you have to say, well, what are the topics important to us? In a large company like that, there might be 100 important topics, in which case you want 100 communities. You don't want two of a kind for each. You want just one of a kind for each topic. So what percent? So if you have 100 and you have 90 communities that address those 100, then you're at 90% of coverage. And finally, health. What percent of communities are meeting the criteria for healthy community? Example of how you can measure health, the number of weekly posts, the number of monthly newsletters. Do you have regular meetings? Do you have critical mass, 100 plus members? Do you have at least 10 people showing up? Obviously, you can tailor these to your organization, but the idea is have some kind of health measurement that you use. Individual community success can be measured on the frequency of threaded discussions, including post replies and new threads, the frequency of newsletters and blog posts, the frequency of conference calls, webinars, and face-to-face meetings, the number of members, both cumulative and the number joining and leaving in a previous month as a sign of how they're doing, and then finally the number of members participating in each event. So you measure your program overall, you measure individual communities, and then within a specific community, you can have participation metrics to get down to a fairly detailed level, right? And whenever I talk about metrics, I always say you want to use metrics to take action. You don't want to have metrics for the sake of metrics. You might have them because you're going to do something once you know them. So if you get down to this level, for example, and you're looking at things like replies, average time to reply, percentage of answered queries, what you want to do with those is take action. If you have communities where the average time to reply is really long, or if the average number of unanswered questions is high, then you want to do an intervention so that gets improved. So that's with any metric, you want to take action with it, not just collect it and admire it. You want to do something with it. So you want to know things like membership, are the number of members increasing or decreasing in the community? What's the participation overall? The number of posts, the number, all these things that you can measure at a detailed, granular level. Technology allows you to do it. So then the question is, what will you do with it once you have it? And if you look at things like the views based on whether it's web, mobile, or email, that can tell you then, how are people really consuming this? Should we improve our interface? Should we improve our app because more people are using it on the mobile than they're using it on the web? Those are the kind of things you can use to take action. Finally, resources that I'll offer. I know Lynda's going to offer some resources as well. I want to start out with my book on the subject, which is called The Handbook of Community Management, a Guide to Leading Communities of Practice. And I was fortunate enough to get a nice endorsement for Carl Odell, the former head of APQC and now chairman. And the book, I think, contains much of what I talked about today in greater detail, and I think will be valuable to if you're starting a communities program or even if you're a veteran at it. And one of the things I want to offer you is that through the end of this month of August, you can buy a copy of it for half off, which is $64 if you use this code. There's a link that you can use if you go to the Greater site. It'll prompt you there, even with the little pop-up about the discount. Take advantage of that. But even so, some people have told me that still feels like that's too high. They don't want to spend that much on a book. And if that's the case, then I'll make you the following deal. I've got 3 other books that I've published through Lucidia. One is called Proven Practices for Promoting a Knowledge Management Program. One's called The 5 C's of KM, and one's called 100 KM Infographics. And those books you can all get for free through Lucidia at the links that you see there. So if you average it out, if you get all 4 books and you pay $64, that'll come out to $16 per book. And hopefully that's a more pleasant number than the other number. So I encourage you to do that. There's also links here to my other resources. I have a lot of content on my site. I've got plenty of content. You can join the SIKM Leaders community. You can follow me on LinkedIn. A lot of ways to get the content, but it's all there and available for you. So with that, there's time for more questions, and I'll be glad to take them now.
You have a lot of questions, Stan, in the chat. And so I'm gonna summarize into a couple of areas so we can hopefully get a lot of these questions answered. But I also want to let everyone know that if we don't get to everything, I'm going to make sure Stan gets these and gives us maybe in writing some answers that we can get back to everybody after the fact. So you've been very popular today, Stan, with lots of stuff and lots of chatter going on in the chat function. But somebody did ask a couple of questions around one I thought was interesting. They said, what's your stance on kind of that internal versus external? It sounds like there's a company that actually had some external communities as well as internal. And how do you talk about managing those together?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for it.
How do you handle the platforms? How do you, all of those things that come with internal versus external?
So typically, you don't blend the two. If you have an internal community, it's often because there's things you might discuss within it that are specific to your organization and may in fact be confidential. And you wouldn't necessarily want people outside the company being a part of it. We encountered this years ago when I was at Deloitte, when Microsoft was about to change the functionality of Yammer and allow external members of internal Yammer networks. And we all, as a group of consulting firms, were against that, because we wanted people to be able to talk about engagements that they were having, which can contain client confidential information that wouldn't benefit from having someone outside of Deloitte participating in it. So with that said, there's benefits to having external communities and internal communities, and you have to recognize what they're each for. The external community, for example, SIKM, that'd be an excellent community to join if you're interested in knowledge management. It's external, it cuts across all of the world and all organizations, and that's where you can probably learn the most about the subject compared to any other community. If you have an internal KM community, you wouldn't learn as much from it probably as you would from that one, but that could be a great place for people to talk about KM at your organization, right? Talking about specifics. So the two have different functions, and you probably would want to have both. But you probably wouldn't try to blend them together. You wouldn't try to invite external people into your internal community, because it gets into a question of what can I talk about now? What's sensitive, what's not. So I would tend not to blend them together. there's room for having external people participate, but you have to do that very selectively and have a very clear purpose for it. Otherwise, I would say keep your internal communities internal, keep your external communities external, belong to both, and recognize when to use one and when to use the other.
Yeah, I like that. It makes me think of like a company that has to work with suppliers. You know, maybe having a community with suppliers specifically for that external purpose to share information would be very valuable. So I like that.
Right, and if you have a project, you know, using a project team site, you might want your customer in there, you might want your supplier, your vendor, your partner, but you'd be cognizant of the fact of who's in here, and you might be careful with the security.
Yeah. So we had a question from someone that is from a small company, and I know you touched on this just slightly, but they specifically have like 300 people in their organization. So what do you recommend if you do want to, I mean, there can still be silos, right, within 300 people. What do you recommend from a community perspective for a real small company like that? Is there still a benefit?
Yes, I would say is if there's some obvious, obvious separate communities to create, just probably 2 or 3, I would do that. But if not, I'd start with one. Because if you don't know, I'd say that we're having a community, we're going to call it the name of our company community. So it's the XYZ company, it's the XYZ community.
Yeah.
And everybody's in there. That's critical mass. You got it already. Of course, you're going to invite them to join, not force them to join. But let's say they all join.
Yeah.
And then over time, you'll see, okay, it seems like logically there's 3 different discussions that tend to go on and 3 different subjects. Let's break it into those 3. So that's allowing it to happen organically and figuring it out if you don't know in advance. And if it never happens, maybe you just always have that community. But also over time, maybe your company grows or you merge and you go from 300 to 1,000. In which case, then you're probably going to need more than one community. By then, you probably have an idea of what those subjects would be, and you'll map out and say, okay, there's 5 subjects that we specialize in. Let's create 5 communities. That'd be a logical time to do it. But I encourage small companies to start with a single company, get used to it, see how it evolves, see what people talk about, and then split up as you go along.
That's great. I like that. That's good advice. I actually just spoke to a company the other day that has a similar situation, a smaller organization, and they have one community for everyone, and it's open to everyone, and it's been going on for like 5 or 6 years now, very effectively. So it can work, right, within a small company.
And it has the advantage of no silo, right? So anything that comes up, everyone gets to see. Whereas when you're in a large company, something could be discussed in one community that might be valuable to another, but unless somebody's specifically performing that boundary spanning, it gets lost within that one.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, Stan, do you recommend from building engagement in communities, do you recommend having some sort of an ambassador or champions type program or people in place to help promote the engagement of communities?
It can be helpful. I think if you have the community of community managers that kind of provides that function, you would encourage anyone who wants to be a champion to belong to that. If you have knowledge management champions more broadly, I think they can take on that role. So I always encourage having a knowledge management community and have representatives from every organization in it and having champions in there. So I wouldn't necessarily have a separate communities champion unless that was appropriate. But if you have a KM champion, make sure that one of their things they're championing is communities.
Communities. Yep. Good advice. And we had a couple people, when we talk about collecting stories, it always comes up that, oh, collecting stories is a challenge, or we can't get people to do it, or how do we do that? So will you talk a little bit more about maybe some proven practices that you've seen with collecting stories and then telling those stories back to the organization?
Yes, there's a couple ways. As I mentioned, one of the beauties of communities is you can collect those stories without having anybody else do something. What I used to do in the Deloitte Yammer network is I just looked for those triads of request, response, thanks, and I would just copy those and put them in a group called the Yammer Wins Group. And I collected hundreds of those. So when anytime anyone would say to me, well, what's the point of Yammer? Why do we have it? Why should we bother? I'd say, all right, let me show you. Here's real examples from our employees. This is not something that I've made up, or it's not something which we commission somebody to come in and write. It's just their own words. This is reality. So I'd start with that. The second thing you can do with people that are reluctant to share stories is to steer people towards it by maybe having a community call where you collect them on the call. So for today's call, we're going to invite you all to come on. Let's talk about our successes in the community, and then have somebody record that or have AI transcribe it or whatever and turn that into stories. And another way you could do that more explicitly is just one-on-one, is go find people that you've seen in the community that seem to be benefiting from it, and then call them up and ask them the questions and just record their answers. All right, so don't make them write anything, don't make them fill in a form. They don't like to do that, but they'll generally talk to you. All right, so talking, even if talking takes longer, it's generally easier. So they'll, okay, I'll agree to talk to you for 15 minutes on the phone, but I'm not going to spend 5 minutes filling in the form. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
We'll call, we'll talk, I'll record it, and we'll use that as the story, and you didn't have to do anything other than the call.
Yeah. I like that. I like both examples of kind of the online approach as well as the in-person or, face-to-face approach. It gives people options and it's great. And you're right, stories are difficult to collect, but they are worth it because I think they're powerful. I think people pay attention to the stories because in it there's actual value and quantitative information as well. But being told coming from someone else always helps, right? So I love that.
Right, and if you're going to motivate people to join, the story is a great way to do it. You tell the story of one of their peers and how they solved a problem. It's hard for them to look at it and go, that's not valuable. It's hard to come up with that answer.
So we have just a couple minutes left, Stan. I'm going to let you have maybe one final statement that you might want to make about communities to set everybody off in the right direction, whether they're continuing to mature or whether they're just getting started in a program. What maybe some final words of wisdom for our group here?
Sure. So I think that the first thing is the communities are not new. They've existed for a long time. Even before we called them communities, there were always kind of professional societies. There were guilds. This goes way back in the history of humanity. We started calling them communities somewhere along the line, but I know from my own experience, I started being involved with communities over 40 years ago. So they're always new for someone, which is great, but they've been around. There's nothing necessarily that technologically fancy about them. You can have a community with very little technology, but they probably have the most benefit of anything. So as Lynda alluded to at the beginning of the call, when people ask me if you can only do one thing out of the 50 things that I've defined that KM can do, what would it be? And the answer is pretty simple. It's communities, because even if you do nothing else, you're now connecting people, you're allowing knowledge to flow between them, you're solving problems, you're answering questions, you're sharing knowledge, you have the mechanisms in place to do almost anything by the fact that the people are there, the people that are paying attention, interacting with each other, and they may never contribute to a repository, and they may never fill in an expertise profile or any of the other things you may be trying to promote. But the community tends to benefit them because we as humans sort of naturally affiliate in communities. So it kind of fits with what we normally do. And that's why they generally are successful, because people choose to join them and they choose to participate in them. And that puts them a leg up on almost anything else that we try to do in KM.
Yeah, I love that. Words of wisdom from Stan. And I can tell you from my own experience in starting a community program in my previous company over 20 years ago, when I look at all of his proven practices, I told him earlier, I know exactly where I learned about communities, because it's exactly how we went about designing and sustaining and evolving and improving our communities over 20 years. And that organization still has communities of practice to this day. So it works. It can be very successful when you follow a lot of this guidance from Stan. And someone put in the chat, how about creating an APQC community of practice and saving all this great info? And that's from Badu. And I know Badu, and it's great. I believe our webinars and the combination of our webinars and our resource library that houses all of the great content we have does constitute a community. And we used to call these webinars the KM community calls, and we've kind of changed them over time. But I still feel like it's a community. So it is what we make of it. But I do like your suggestion, Badu, about calling things communities, because that's what we're doing. We're coming together as a community. So with that said, I want to thank Stan so much for his contribution today. And I'm just going to pop to the last slide that for today, just to remind you that in addition to the amazing resources Stan shared, you all were asking questions throughout the chat about if we have resources at APQC as well. So I tried to put some to get you started with what we have in our resource library that might help you in thinking about communities of practice, whether it's standing them up, measuring them, and all of that. So you'll find a lot of similar information with case studies and research to back up all of this information. And again, with that, I want to thank Stan. I want to thank everybody who was on the call today. I think this was a fantastic session, and I can't wait to get a hold of the transcript in the chat and put it all together in a really great summary for everybody to be able to refer back to, in addition to the slides and the recording. So with that, I will say have a wonderful day, and hopefully we see you again next month.